send our young ones to class, and then we'll go ahead and jump into the book of Esther. Hope you're doing well tonight. The rain came just in time to get you a little bit wet before you came to worship tonight. So we came to Bible class. So you are hopefully drier than some of us are. But we're glad to see everybody tonight. Glad that the storm wasn't as bad as it was last week, and we're together again. I want to continue to remember Stephen Dauberman in our prayers. Hopefully you've been praying for him continuously, and just continue to pray for him. Great trial that he's going through. And of course, keep Dwight and Sadie in your prayers as well, because that's very difficult on them as well. Continue to lift each other up in prayer. Does everybody have an outline for tonight's study? Does anybody need an outline? Maybe I should say it that way. All right, great. Well, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, and then we'll send our little ones to class, and then we'll jump into our Bible study. Father, we thank you so much for the occasion that brings us together tonight to assemble with open Bibles and open hearts to really soak in your word, Father, to build us and encourage us, to get us to know you better and to see your loving providential care and how you love us and how you look after us each day, even when we sometimes feel that you're not doing so. We know that behind the scenes, Father, your power is working. We love you and we praise you. We thank you for every good and perfect gift, because we know everything that we enjoy in this life comes from your bountiful hand. Please help us to be thankful for the things that we have. Help us to weather the storms of life, knowing that you are there for us. Thank you so much for your word that's been passed down through the ages, that we can have it tonight in our language, that we can read it and study it and know your will. Father, please continue to bless those on our prayer list, especially be with our brother Stephen Dauberman as he goes through a great trial. Father, we just pray you'll continue to bless he and bless Dwight and Sadie as well. Help us to continue to lift each other up in prayer. We're looking forward to great things for your kingdom here. We just pray you'll open doors of opportunity for us. Please be with us tonight as we study. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, young'uns, if you want to follow Miss Jolene and Miss Brielle to your classes, want to remind you, if you haven't signed up for the 26th of September, that is the Lewistown Sing. We were going to, after our worship in the morning here, we are going to eat lunch together in the multi-purpose room. We are going to board the bus at 12:45, and we are going to drive to Lewistown to the Sing, which begins at 2 o'clock. We will sing and worship God with our brethren there. And then after that, about 3 o'clock, they're going to have some fellowship and some snacks. We're going to stick around for a few minutes to get to know them and to enjoy some food with them. And then we will bring the bus back to the building here. So probably be back here around, I'm guessing, maybe 5:30 or 6 o'clock. I'm not sure. Around that time, probably no later than 5:30. Just depends on how everything works out. But if you haven't signed up, please sign up. We need you to sign up, so I need to know how many's going for a couple of reasons. Those who are preparing food need to know how much to prepare for lunch. And then secondly, depending on how many we have, is the size of bus we'll need. And I need to go ahead and try to get that reserved as quickly as I can. So, but sign up if you're able to go. It's going to be a really nice trip. We're going to have a good time. It's about an hour to Lewistown. We're all going to ride together in the bus, and we can fellowship, and we can even sing if you want to on the way over. Tune up our voices, and then when we get over there, we can sing with our brethren there. All right, we're in the book of Esther. I hope you have an outline and an open Bible tonight. We're going to look at one of the great gems between the time period of the first part of Ezra and the last part of Ezra. Really is where Esther fits in, and we'll look at that a little bit tonight. We're going to begin with some introductory material that is not on your outline. So when we get to your outline, I'll let you know that we're there. We may get to that outline tonight. We probably should. But I want to give some background. I want us to kind of know what the book of Esther is about, where we're heading with the book, where we find ourselves, and why we are there in the book of Esther. What's going on that we would choose this book to study next? Because you remember we studied Ezra, Nehemiah, and now we're looking at Esther. Well, is it because they all three go together in our Bibles? Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, is that why? Well, that is why. But there's a reason why they go together. The reason they're there together is not always this is the case with the books of the Bible in our English Bibles. But in this context, this is right. Because you've got the same time frame, and you're going to see that hopefully tonight. The book of Esther is different than most other books of the Bible. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, or there's a couple of reasons why it's different. Number one, it is named after a woman, which only one other Bible book is characterized by that. Anybody know what that other book is? Ruth. Very good. Awesome. Ruth. So you have 2 books named after ladies. That's out of 66 books, only 2. That's kind of a minority. So Esther is a book named after a woman as well as Ruth is. The book of Esther also describes a feast that is not mentioned anywhere else in the Old Testament. And that is the Feast of Purim. And we'll talk about that. Today, Jews still celebrate that feast. It's a pretty big holiday for them. And we'll understand a little bit why that's a big holiday when we get to that point near the end of the book of Esther. Thirdly, and this is kind of interesting, the name of God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. The name of God, Yahweh, does not appear in the book of Esther. 10 chapters are void of God's name. But what's interesting about that is, although his name doesn't appear per se, his finger is on every single word of that book. And we're going to see his providential hand throughout the entire book. It's amazing. And this is going to be encouraging for us, because what providence is God working within the confines of nature, the natural law. Miracles are different than providence. Miracles are God circumventing the natural order of things. For example, it is natural for a man to come together with a woman and bear a child. It is not in natural law for a woman to have a child without a man, without the seed of man. Okay, let me be more technical in our world in which we live today. Without the seed of man. But Jesus was a miracle, because there was no man involved in the conception of Jesus. That's a miracle. But you know what? Every other birth is providential. It's God working within the confines of nature. And that's the reason I use that illustration. A lot of people, and I understand where they're coming from, but a lot of people see birth and they'll say, oh, it's a miracle of God. Well, it's not a miracle of God. It is God working within the confines. Is it powerful? Oh, you got to believe it. Man, you look at how God designed the human bodies and how reproduction occurs. Amazing. But it's within his natural law, so it's not a miracle. A miracle is a storm blowing up on the Sea of Galilee and God saying, hold it, stop it right now, and the sea automatically goes calm. Providence is a storm coming about, and we pray really hard, God, please spare our lives, and please don't let this storm kill us. And a day later, the storm calms down. That's not a miracle. That is God answering our prayers providentially within the confines of nature. And so this book is about the providence of God. Lastly, the book of Esther is not quoted anywhere in the New Testament, which is sort of strange in one respect, because a lot of books of the Old Testament are quoted in the New Testament. Now, those are just some interesting background material. It's kind of some neat things that you need to know about the book of Esther as we go into it. So just kind of keep that in mind. Let's look at a little bit of background. Where are we at here? What's happened? Some of this will be a little bit repetition that we've already dealt with in Ezra and Nehemiah, but the best way to learn is to keep listening, keep hearing the same things. Now, it won't be the exact same thing, so bear with me. All right, background. Because of Judah's sins. Now, Judah, when I talk about Judah, what am I talking about here? Who am I talking about? Southern kingdom. Good, Mike. Southern kingdom. Well, what happened to the northern kingdom? Who are they known as? Israel. Now, this is where sometimes people get confused when they study the Old Testament, because sometimes the northern kingdom specifically is called Israel, and sometimes the entire nation from north to south is called Israel, and especially in writings, when you read people's writings, that they're writing about the Old Testament. So we have the northern kingdom, we have the southern kingdom, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. When did that happen? That happened, we had Saul, David, Solomon, 3 kings in what we call the United Kingdom. All the 12 tribes were happy. Everybody was worshiping good. But then we had Solomon in 1 Kings, just about the middle of 1 Kings. 1 Kings 1 through 11 is Solomon's reign. We hit chapter 12. Solomon passes the torch on to his son by the name of Rehoboam. Rehoboam does some stupid things, and he splits the kingdom. And so 10 northern tribes went with a man by the name of Jeroboam the first. Just in case you think like I did when I was a teenager, they weren't brothers, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. I thought that for years, they were brothers. Sounds like they should be, right? They weren't. Jeroboam the first went up with the 10 northern tribes, and then Rehoboam took the southern 2 tribes, and then it was chaos and pandemonium from there on out. Okay, God said, that's not going to happen. You people went into idolatry, all kinds of sinful practices, and so what happened was, in 721 BC, God said, Assyria is going to come in and carry the northern tribes away. They never came back as a nation. They were scattered among the people. Now, when you come to the New Testament, you start reading about people called the Samaritans, and you'll read about them in the Old Testament too. But we really hit them in the heart in the New Testament. We start reading about Samaritans, and who in the world, where did these Samaritans come from? That's where they came from. They came from primarily the 10 northern tribes that intermixed with all the land, all the people of the land. And they were a mixed breed. They weren't purebred Jews. They were what we would call, and I mean this very kindly, but they were half-breeds. They weren't full-blooded Jews. And so they were Samaritans. The southern kingdoms stuck together for a while, and there was a lot of pandemonium, bad kings in there. And then what happened? Who came in and overtook the southern kingdom? Now, before you answer, think back to Ezra and Nehemiah. That was the return back. But where were those people at when they came back from where? They were coming back to Jerusalem. They were coming back to Jerusalem. Where were they at? Where had they been carried away? Babylon. Anybody remember the king that carried them away? Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah, and if you want to remember that, just remember that old denominational preacher in West Virginia that I heard on the radio, Nebuchadnezzar, if you can't remember Nebuchadnezzar, okay? Nebuchadnezzar is what he called him on the radio. I'll never forget that. And maybe that's the way you pronounce it. Maybe I'm wrong all these years, but I've always heard it Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar came in, very powerful under Babylon, and he took those 2 southern tribes and he carried them back to Babylon. Now, here's what we need to understand. When he carried them back, he didn't carry everybody back. People like Jeremiah was left. Some people were older that he couldn't use, and he left them back in Jerusalem. So there was still a segment back in Jerusalem, but the nation was not united in Jerusalem. So he carries them away in 3 deportments. Now, it's important to understand the 3 deportments because when he took them away in 3 deportments, they came back in 3 regimes as well. So he came in first in 606 BC, and he carried, your Daniels, your Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. He carried the younger group away, that he could make eunuchs, that he could put to work, that he could really use for his kingdom. Because remember, he's building his kingdom. He's trying to be as powerful as he can be. Then in the second deportment, he brought away some people, maybe like Ezekiel, maybe people that were a little bit older. And now Ezekiel never went into Babylon. He was actually down by the river, and he stayed kind of out in the wilderness, and that's where he did his prophesying. And so you have men like that. Then in the third deportment, he comes in, and the walls are torn down, and he destroys the temple. 586, the temple is destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar's back in Babylon. He's a powerful, powerful entity, and his kingdom's growing. The problem is, with every powerful entity, what always happens? There's a more powerful one comes in. A lot of times because of pride. That's Nebuchadnezzar's biggest problem, is pride, okay? So another entity comes in and overtakes Babylon, and that was the Persians. All right, now's where our story starts to make sense. Oh, okay, Persia. Okay, there was a man that was conquering Babylon. He was the leader of the Persian nation at that point. His name was Cyrus, and wouldn't you know it, Cyrus the Great. So you kind of see his attitude in the whole thing, right? Cyrus the Great comes in, and he destroys Babylon, and he sets up his little kingdoms. He has several capitals. Persians had several capitals. One was in a place called Susa, or Shushan, okay? And that's where the kings would essentially spend a lot of their winter months. Now, who was in Shusha prior to our study of Esther? Who was in Shusha when he heard the bad news about Jerusalem? You remember? Nehemiah. Remember, Nehemiah was in that part. He was a cupbearer to the king, so he was in Susha. So here we have Cyrus the Great comes to power, and he says, hey, you Jews, go ahead back. You can go back to Jerusalem. Go back. That was God's providence, by the way. So the Jews begin to go back. You remember they went back in three deportments, or three regimes, the same way they came out in three deportments. So here, they came back under Zerubbabel. We studied him, right? Ezra 1 through 6. So just step with me back to the book of Ezra real quick. Chapters 1 through 6, we walk back to Jerusalem with Zerubbabel. Almost 50,000 Jews go with him. We walk back into Jerusalem, and the city is lying in waste, and we begin to build the temple. And we end up finishing the temple, kind of dragging our feet at it, but we finish the temple in Ezra 1 through 6. Okay? Then there's going to be a second return. But before we get to the second return, I just want you to stand between Zerubbabel and the 50,000 Jews. The temple's right at your left foot. The second return is at your right foot, and it's going to happen with a man by the name of Ezra. He's going to come back and spiritually reform the people. But right here, right between your 2 feet, stands Esther. That's where the book fits in. So it actually fits in between Ezra 1 through 6, Ezra 7 through 12. Okay? It's right in the middle of the book of Ezra. All right? Now, we already studied Ezra, and the reason I wanted to continue through Ezra into Nehemiah was because those kind of flowed together. All right? But now I'm going to come back and interrupt that flow for a minute, and we're going to step back in between those two chapters, 6 and 7, and we're going to place the book of Esther there, because that's where it is. Now, when they came back to Jerusalem, that is the Jews, when they came back to Jerusalem, not everybody came back. In fact, remember we talked about that? Not everybody wanted to come back. Because remember my illustration? They planted their fruit trees in their gardens, and they amended their soil, and they brought in a bunch of cow manure and stuff on their gardens, and they didn't want to leave that, right? You know, I'm sermonizing there, but you can imagine that. They set up their decor. Their grandkids were born in those houses. They didn't want to leave that. Back in the palace at Susa, that was the case. And there were some people back there that were Jews that had been carried out of Jerusalem that are still back there. You'll know a couple of them. One, her name is Esther. Two, his name is Mordecai. And those are going to be the two main ones that we're going to study in the book of Esther. All right? So who was Mordecai? Well, Mordecai was back in Jerusalem at one time, but Babylon carried him away. And when Zerubbabel came back, then Ezra came back, then Nehemiah came back, Mordecai didn't come back. He was still in Persia, apparently enjoying where he lived, and so he stayed there. In that middle time frame, Esther fits in, about 479 BC. Now, when you open Google or you do a search in any of your Bible books, you're going to find lots of debate about this, okay? But the events happen somewhere between Ezra 6 and 7. That's about when the time frame is. All right. Nehemiah came back to reestablish the walls. Ezra came back to build the people. Zerubbabel came back to build the temple, and now Jerusalem's functioning, and they're functioning as a nation. But there are still Jews to be thought of over here in Persia, and that's where Esther is going to come in. Some were scattered throughout the Persian Empire, and some were in Susha, and that's kind of where our story picks up. The story of Esther is about some of those Jews who remained in Persia, in particular in the capital, one of the capitals, named Susa. All right, so think of that. Everybody got that in their mind? Because that could be a little bit confusing. And I know when I've studied this in the past, and especially when I was younger, trying to fit all this into a timeline was very confusing for me. So if you have any trouble with this, like, don't feel bad. I think a lot of people, for me, when it began to make sense is when I put it in a time frame. I have to put it in a timeline and see where everybody's at and what everybody's doing and think about that. Now, it's important for us to know that Mordecai's a Jew and Esther's a Jew. That's going to be very important to the whole story. If we miss that, we're going to miss the whole boat, okay? So those two Jews. All right, let's look at a couple of interesting facts about Esther. Esther, the book of Esther, is read annually at the Feast of Purim, even at this time, for practicing Jews. And you know, when I say practicing Jews, you understand no Jew can truly practice Judaism because nobody can relate their genealogy. They don't know where they came from for sure. But there are people that try to practice Judaism. They read the book of Esther at the Feast of Purim. At which time, and I thought this was interesting, at which time they read the book in the synagogue when they gather together. Charity is distributed, so they bring in their goods, kind of almost like the first century church, bring stuff together and they kind of share it with each other. Food is exchanged, which I thought was really funny. That must have been when we picked up our potluck meals, right? They came together, they exchange food, and then they get together and they eat a festival meal, is what they call it. It's a festival meal. And so it's almost like a big celebration. It's a celebration because the Jews were saved from genocide. So this is a memorial that they are very serious about, and they love it. The Jews that practice that get together and do this once a year. Esther, the name of the queen that we're going to find in this book, her name means star, which I thought was interesting because when you read the book of Esther, who's the star? Esther, she's the star, and her name means star. In Persian, her Hebrew name is Hadassah, which means myrtle. Myrtle. So if you know anybody by the name of Esther, go up and call her Myrtle, and she may be very impressed with that, or she may not be so impressed with that, but that's what the name means. All right, any questions? Let's step into an overview. What I'm going to do tonight is I want to do an overview of the book. I'm just going to kind of give you some meat to chew on, and then we're going to jump into one chapter, and we're going to start to slice the meat, okay? So here's the overview. Look at the forest. Remember, those of you who are familiar with my teaching, one thing I like to do when I study something, I like to kind of, okay, what's the big story here? What's the deal? What's going on? Break it down. All right, number one, banquet. And this isn't even on your outline yet. So you can write this down if you want to. It's up to you. Banquet. One word. I like to put everything in one word. Banquet. What happens at the beginning of the book? The book begins with a banquet given by the king. The king, his name is Ahasuerus, or Xerxes is the Greek version of that name. So the king at the time, book of Esther, opens with this big banquet, this big feast he opens up. He says, I'm going to get everybody together, and basically he's kind of go down through some of his military strategy. He brings all his military men together. He also says to the queen, who, by the way, is a lady by the name of Vashti at this point. He says, hey, babe, I want you to throw a little party too, and I want you to have everybody over there in the court, and let's just have a big shindig, okay? Let's get together. And this feast lasted for many, many months. This was a huge feast. Now, there was a portion of the feast that lasted 7 days, but this thing was a lengthy party. It was a military campaign as well. He was putting military strategy together. We see that kind of from all the people he brought into the meeting, all right? Big party. But like some parties, especially one with a worldly twist, Xerxes wasn't the most godly man in the world, and we're going to see that. He began to be bringing in the alcohol because apparently he thought he couldn't have a good time without it. And so he began to get merry with wine, and he said, I got a great idea. Well, let me get ahead of myself. Let's go to the second word. Banquet, boiling. Oh boy. So he says to Queen Vashti, he says, honey, what I want you to do is I want you to come in. Now, the old King James isn't going to lay this out for you quite like really what happened, just because of some of the terminology. But basically what he wanted her to do was come in and show your beauty, okay? Now, to us, that sounds like, man, what a husband, huh? What a good guy. He just wanted everybody to see his wife. Not so good, okay? He didn't want her to just come in and say, look at her hair. Look how pretty she is. No, he wanted her to come in and in a very ungodly way expose herself, because he has all these officials together. What's he want to do? He wants to brag. He's arrogant. Oh, he's arrogant. But he also wants them to have a good time. I don't know any of you, some of you I'm sure do this, travel on business. You ever travel on business? I remember traveling on business, and sometimes, before I get into preaching, I'd travel on business, and people think when you go in on business, there are a couple of things a man wants when he's away from home. Alcohol and women. That's what some automatically think. Hey, you come up, we'll talk over that deal, and I'll tell you what, I'll take you out on Friday night, we'll have a good time, right? Isn't that what happens in the world? Because they think you want to go to a club, and they think you want to see things that Christians don't see. They think that you want to drink things that Christians don't drink. So the king was just trying to fix everybody up with a good time. Vashti says, no, I'm not doing it. Well, this infuriates the king. And again, you see his character here. He's an arrogant, can I say this? Take me off camera for a minute. He's an arrogant pig. It's what he is. He's sickening. I can't even believe he'd ask his wife to do this, but he does. And so he's boiling now. Banquet was thrown, he's boiling because she said no. Well, there's the third part to the story that I find very interesting, and that's blessing. That's blessing. Because in the middle of it, Esther, who had lost her mom and dad. Now, I want to look through the eyes of Esther for a minute, because sometimes our world seems to fall apart, doesn't it? Don't you have sometimes your world fall apart? You think you got your list of troubles and trials and tribulations? Why me? Esther could ask that question. Why me? She lost her mom and dad. She's an orphan. She's adopted by her cousin, Mordecai. Now, Mordecai's a good guy, and he looks after her, and he raises her, and obviously does a good job raising her. But the girl still didn't grow up with her mother. Think about that. This young lady didn't have parents, and she didn't have really family to speak of. Mordecai's her cousin, and that's who's raising her. She could have easily said, God, why are you doing this to me? But you never see that in Esther's life. She was given this is what was given to her, but she uses it to be a blessing to God and his kingdom. So, Mordecai, it sort of sets her in the middle because now the king's mad and he fires Vashti, divorces her. Get out of here. I want a new queen. So he goes, get me, and you can kind of see his arrogant pride here too. You get me some nice looking virgins. That's what he asks for. He said, I want some babes, all right? I want some babes to come in, and I want them to be given the royal treatment. This is what's interesting. And you can see what kind of pig he is, ladies. You'll agree with me. He wants them to eat a certain diet. Oh, wasn't he concerned about their health? No, he was concerned about what his eyes saw. He wanted them to fit the Miss America pageant, right? That's what he did. He gave them a special diet. He gave them special spices and herbs for their body, special perfumes, special clothing. Oh, I'm going to fancy you up because this man is interested in one thing. This is what we can see. So he does this. All these women, they come before him, and anybody want to take a wild guess who gets picked? Well, there's a guy. He doesn't get picked, by the way. but there's a guy that looks at Esther and he says, man, you are something special. You're something special. In fact, I'm going to take you off to the side and I'm going to give you even more of the royal treatment. And he does. And he gives her more of the royal treatment. And she is beautiful. And when she goes before the king says, I want you. I'm picking you for my queen. So here's the blessing. I want you to look at the debauchery of the king. I want you to look at the terrible situation Vashti has. Now she's no longer queen. We don't read much about her after this. I'm not sure what happened to her. We see Esther coming up with all these troubles and tribulations, but now God's going to use this. And you see his providential hand behind it? You see God guiding Esther right where he wants her? Now, Esther didn't know that. She didn't know any of this. She's like you and I. We're in the middle of our lives, and God's opening doors and closing doors and opening windows. And why is this happening? Why did this happen to me? Well, it may just be that God's guiding you where you need to be. And so sometimes it's okay to just let the doors open and close as God opens and closes them, and don't throw such a fit about it. You know what I mean? Because God is behind much of what we don't see. His providence. He's providing for his people. Fourthly, we see some blood. That's going to be my fourth B, blood. Mordecai, remember he's a good guy. He is now in the inner court because he raised Esther, and so now he's kind of in the inner court. And he hears a plot. He hears a plot one day. He overhears these two guys talking about how they're going to kill the king. And Mordecai says, well, we're going to put a stop to that. So he goes and tells Esther, hey, here's what I heard. Esther goes into the king and says, hey, here's what we heard. King says, man, hang him on the gallows. And what's that guy's name? They said his name's Mordecai. So, and here's where it's really interesting, because do you remember in the book of Daniel, and if you haven't studied Daniel, you may not remember all this, but there's some phrases like, it is written in the law of the Medes and the Persians. And you and I in the 21st century read right over that and we think, okay, it's written in the law of the Medes and Persians. But when something's written down in the Chronicles of the King like that, in the law of the Medes and the Persians, it can't be changed. It's got his insignia on it. It is not going to be changed. So that's going to be important. Write this guy's name down, and he writes it down in the Chronicles, but the king kind of forgets about it. Doesn't honor Mordecai at all. Mordecai's like, you don't see this in the text, but put yourself in his position. Look at what I just did. I just saved the king's life. No reward for me. What's going on here? God, are you forgetting me? I raised Esther. Look at what I've done for you. You forgot all about me. And he might have gone and he might have complained to God and he might have pleaded, God, you forget me. No blessings for me. Mordecai, hang tight. This is going to come back. And God's providence, he didn't bless you right now because God's going to bless you later with something even greater. All right? Blood. The next one I go to is bowing. Bowing. So there's a man in the story that comes up. His name's Haman. If there's anybody in the Bible you don't want to be like, you don't want to be like Haman. But the problem is, so many times humanity is like Haman. Haman is filled with pride. He wants to be right next to the king, and he wants to rub elbows with the rich and famous. He wants people to see him in his light and his glory. And so Haman, he's a favorite of the king, by the way. He wants everybody to bow to him when they walk by. When he walks by, he basically wants you to step out of the way and, Sir Haman, oh, Haman's here. Let's all bow to Haman. Everybody's doing it. You listening to me, young people? Everybody's doing it. Everybody's doing it in the kingdom because they don't want to lose their head. Haman's a powerful individual. If I stand up against him, he'll kill me. Well, one day, Mordecai comes walking by Haman, and he just walks on by, and Haman's furious. You didn't bow to me. Bow to me. Mordecai's like, and I'm sermonizing a little bit. I bow to one, and that's God only. That's the only one I'm going to bow to. Get out of my way, Haman. So he doesn't bow while Haman is infuriated. And if you think about this, this has been sometimes called the Haman complex. Haman had everybody in the kingdom bowing to him, but one guy, Mordecai. And he's infuriated. His whole world is in turmoil because he has one man not bowing to him. Is that pretty sad? Isn't that kind of how we are sometimes? We can have all the blessings in our world, and one thing, and I'm not trying to make light of our troubles, but this is me. Hey, I'm talking about me. One little thing spins out of control over here, and you know what? Just forget it. I don't want any part of it. I throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Because, no, Haman complex. Haman complex. Mordecai doesn't bow. Next B is boldness. Mordecai is in the inner circle again, and now Haman is infuriated, and he says, who is that guy? I said, well, that's Mordecai the Jew. Remember I told you, don't miss the fact that Mordecai's a Jew? He says, we're going to annihilate the Jews. Here's the really cool part of the story. Esther, when she came to be queen, she never said, oh, here's my genealogy card. I'm a Jew. She never said it. She just kind of put it in her pocket, and I don't want to say that. She just put it in her pocket, and she didn't tell them what nationality she was. She just kept her mouth shut. She just did her thing. So Mordecai hears the plot for Haman. He's going to kill all the Jews. So Esther thinks quickly. Providentially, no doubt, she thinks, and she says, I'm going to throw a feast, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring the king, and I'm going to bring Haman into this banquet I'm going to throw for them. And what she does is she sort of sets the plan. She says, here's what, and of course Haman, he's just elated. I mean, he's in the party with the king. Just the king and him are invited to the queen's establishment, and he's in this royal ball, and he's thrilled. But he still has a complex. His complex is still over Mordecai not bowing. All right? So when he leaves the party, he goes home, and his wife, and remember I was talking about this on Sunday, a good woman and a good man can really complement one another. A bad woman can really hurt a good man, and a bad man can really hurt a good woman. And this is kind of the complex with Haman. He gets home, and his wife says, well, you know what? You're the greatest. You were invited to the party tonight. She just feeds his ego. And he's just getting a bigger head and bigger head and bigger head. And he says, you know what? I'm going to build me gallows. I'm going to build me gallows to hang Mordecai on. And I'm going to hang him right out in front. Everybody can know about it. And everybody will see that I'm the boss. And she said, that's a great idea. And his family said, that's a great idea. We'll help you. Let's get the lumber. And so he builds these big gallows to hang Mordecai on. Well, Esther is thinking. She's using her head. And so she talks to the king and kind of works behind the scenes. And the king says, you know what? I can't sleep one night. He said, would somebody bring the Chronicles of the Kings out and read them to me? I want a bedtime story. You can see the hand of God here, can't you? Can you see the hand of God in this? This is our God working to preserve his people. You and I are his people. What's he doing today? We won't know. We don't know all the time what he's doing because it's behind the scenes. Mordecai didn't know anything about this plan. Esther didn't even know about the plan. The king was an ungodly, unruly, and you know what? He's being used by God. He can't sleep one night, and they say, let's bring the Chronicles out. So they happen to open up to the section where two men were plotting to kill the king. And there was a man saved them, and the king says, wait a minute, what'd you just say? And he said, there was a man saved you. What was his name? Mordecai. And he said, well, hold on a second. What would we ever do to that guy? This is years later. What'd we ever do to honor him? And then, well, you know what, king? We've never done a thing. Now here's Mordecai on his bed at night, probably sobbing from years of hurt pride, right? Oh, he's a man, you know he was. He was hurting because nobody honored Mordecai, but he wasn't that kind of guy. But isn't that where we're at? Nobody honored me. Nobody mentioned me. Hang tight, Mordecai. The king says, we've got to honor this guy. We've got to do something special for him. So Esther says, I got a plan. She says, let's have a little party, king and Haman, and here's what you ask, king. And so anyway, the king's going to ask, how do you think I should honor a man in my kingdom, Haman? Remember his head's this big? You know what he thought? It's me. I'll tell you, king, glad you asked. I think I would put a robe on him, and I think I would parade him throughout the kingdom. And have everybody just chant and holler his name because he's the greatest. And Haman's thinking, this is going to be me. I'm the man. King says, that's a great idea, Haman. I want you to go get Mordecai, and I want you to do this for Mordecai. And you can just see Haman's rage. He's so mad. He can breathe fire. And so he does. They put the robe on Mordecai and around. But do you remember a minute ago I said that Haman's plot to kill the Jews? Well, the king had already said, it's okay. Let's go ahead and annihilate them. Esther comes up and she says, do you know, king, you know I'm a Jew, don't you? And he says, uh-oh. Man, I messed up. I wrote a law, and I can't take it back. It's the law of the Persians. I can't take it back. What am I going to do? He says, here's what I'll do. You Jews have a right to defend yourself. Go ahead and fight back. And as for you, Haman, you know that gallows you built for Mordecai? Let's hang you on it today. So they hung Haman on the very gallows that he built for Mordecai. All right, why? Because Mordecai allowed vengeance to belong to God. Mordecai wasn't worried about himself. He was worried about God and God's plan. Mordecai stood back in the background, didn't get any praise or glory for raising poor little Esther, didn't get any praise or glory for saving the king. He just stood back and he did his work for God. And you know what God did? God put him on a pedestal and allowed everybody else to see how great he was. You know why? Because Mordecai didn't let everybody else see how great he was. Do you remember verses in the Bible about humility? God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. That's the story right there. That's the picture we see. Haman's hanging on the gallows. The Jews defend themselves, and guess what? The Feast of Purim is a reality. That's what it is, a celebration of the Jews winning the battle against their enemies. And now we have a whole nation of people in Persia preserved by Queen Esther and a man named Mordecai that you don't read hardly anything about except in this little book that bears her name. You don't really read anything about him in the Hall of Faith, Hebrews 11. He's not a man that you would, name your kid Mordecai. Let me tell you something. He's a man that we ought to live by, a man that we ought to live after, a man, an example that we ought to follow, because he was a man that did God's work and he was praised and blessed for it. Any questions or comments? That's the overview. You're thinking, why are we going to study it? You just gave us the overview because I want you to hear it from the mouth of God, and there are treasures that we're going to mine in here. Any questions or comments on it? All right, great. So let's go to chapter 1, all right? I love it when I look at a story like this of God and I can see his finger of providence throughout it. And I don't want us to forget this, folks. Don't ever forget this, and especially when we're in the book of Esther. And don't let me forget it, all right? God is working in the lives of men. He's working in our lives. He's opening doors that we have no idea that he's opening. He's closing doors that we have no idea that he's closing. He's doing things in our lives that we're saying, why in the world would that have happened to me, God? And God says, because you see one-dimensional, and I see all dimensions, and I'm here to bless your life. Just do what you need to do for me, and I'll take care of the rest. And isn't that really what the book of Revelation sums up the Bible with? Be you faithful till death, and I'll give thee a crown of life. God is going to put us on the royal pedestal one day. He's going to give us our crown, and we're going to be rewarded for all the slights in life, all the lack of praise, all the lack of accolades we've gotten for doing His will. But you know what? There's a lot of people going to be in heaven that you never knew their name. But when you get there, you'll learn their name. All right, let's look. Here's where your outline begins. Number 1, Esther's coronation. The word coronation should be the blank you fill in. Chapter 1 and 2, Esther's coronation. All right. The second one under that, letter A, the rejection of Vashti. We don't need to spend a ton of time here, but I do want us to look at a few things as we go through this. The rejection of Vashti is found in chapter 1, verses 1 through 22. Verse number 1, now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Do you see his power? You see, and it's interesting how apologetic value is in the Bible even when it's not intended to be. Apologetic meaning this is the Word of God and we can see it. He's not just telling you this is some Ahasuerus. He's telling you this is the Ahasuerus that ruled over 127 provinces from here to here. And there is archaeological evidence and other evidences to prove that this is true. All right, just another fascinating thing. All right, so number 1 under the rejection of Vashti is the king. The king. So you should have the first 3 blanks filled in. The first one is Esther's coronation. The second blank would be rejection of Vashti. The third blank would be the king, verses 1 and 2. Let's look at verse 2. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all of his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles, and the princes of the provinces being before him. Now, so you kind of see in these first couple verses who's at this party. This is a big gathering. This isn't like an afternoon brunch. Or a late morning brunch, I guess. This is a big ordeal. There's lots of officials. I mean, everybody's here. Everybody's going to partake in this. The king's really going to show them. Let's look at a couple things under the king. This is on your outline. Ahasuerus is essentially the word that we would use in his Hebrew name. Xerxes would be the Greek version of that name. And the reason I give you those both, not to memorize them or just give you blank facts, is when you read in the Bible, sometimes the Bible will go from Ahasuerus to Xerxes. And, sometimes that goes back and forth, and you're kind of like, wait a minute. And the reason I'm saying that is because I know in my study of the Bible, I sometimes have to take a piece of paper and a pen, and I have to kind of write down, okay, verse 1, Ahasuerus. Okay, verse 2, Xerxes. And I draw a little line, and I'll go look in a Bible dictionary. No, those are the same guy. Now, I don't necessarily have to do it in the book of Esther, but I'm saying in other places. Because when they start throwing names, sometimes that can confuse you. Think about the announcements sometimes in the church building. Doesn't it confuse you? If I said, hey, we're going to have a potluck and brother so-and-so is over it. And if we have 2 brother so-and-sos, you're like, who? Not, what? Didn't he say? Did he say Dave or Doug? Doug or Dave? Wait, which Dave? Dave or? We get confused, don't we? And that's the way it is sometimes when you study the Bible. So Ahasuerus, the Hebrew, Xerxes, the Greek. All right, Cyrus, here's an interesting part of this. Cyrus was his grandfather. And so Cyrus was the great. So this guy comes down through the ranks. He has power. It's been given to him. The Persian Empire was divided into 127 provinces. These would be kind of like our states, maybe not exactly like that, but kind of similar to our states. I guess would be maybe the best way to explain that. The Persian Empire was vast and it was powerful. That's important to the story because you're going to see why the king had so much power and why he liked to throw his power around. Here's what we're going to do. Here, I want you to do this. You kind of see his arrogance, but it's kind of normal for him to have that arrogance, I think, with his vast power. All right, the king. Secondly, verses 3 through 11, let's look at the fling. calling it the fling because that's exactly what it is. So he brings all these people together. Verse 4, he shows them the riches of his glorious kingdom, the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. 180 days he throws a party. Do you notice the gist of this party? Now it's part of the military strategy, part of some things that are going to take place in the future, probably with his kingdom. But not only that, he brings them to show him his glory and his power. Like, you see the kind of guy we're dealing with here? This guy is just arrogant. He just wants people to see him. Look at me. Verse 5, when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan. So now, at the end of the 180 days, he says, okay, now we're going to have a special 7-day feast. Everybody's invited. All the peasants are invited to this too. All the people who were present in Shushan, the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple and silver rods, and marble pillars. And the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. Verse 7, they served drinks in golden vessels. Are you getting the picture here? Are you seeing who this guy is and how much money he has? He's giving them golden cups to drink out of. He has couches with gold on them. He has all these established, beautiful things. And you know, this is amazing. All the money that's going into this, all the big to-do about this, but it's all about him. It's all about him. Why I want you to see that so clearly is because it's amazing to me how this man thought he was self-sufficient. He doesn't need God. And you know what he is? He is a puppet. He is a puppet in the hands of God Almighty. God is using him. God is going to use this guy, even in his sinful state, to save his people. Now that ought to encourage us. We get all wound up about things today. We get all wound up over worldly affairs. Who's God using today? I don't know, because I don't know the end of the story. I'm in the middle of the story. I'm with Esther and Mordecai. I don't know what the end of the story is going to be like. Is he using Russia? I don't know. Could he use China? I don't know. Could he use the Wuhan virus? Could he? I don't know. What's he going to use? I don't know, but I know one thing. There's no virus or nation or leader or gold or silver or anything in this world that's bigger than my God. And he's in control. And these puppet masters that think they're in control, I laugh because my God's on the throne. And remember that. Don't get all worked up about the affairs of this world. Listen, one of these days, heaven's going to split wide open and this whole earth's going to burn. We're going to win, okay? We're going to win. There's no question. Be thou faithful. Watch him. All right. So he throws this fling, verses 3 through 11. Verse 9, Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded all these buttermilk buddies of his, who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. So, just like we kind of recapped a minute ago, he was wanting them to see her beauty, but more than her beauty, okay? Very much a lustful show. Very, very poor judgment on the king's part, but then again, what do you expect from a worldly man, right? Can't expect much different. All right, the king, the fling, the sting. The sting. Watch this. Now, this is like a stinger. Oh, I can't tell you that part without telling you a little quick story. Get your mind off Esther for a minute. And I just want to tell you a quick story about me. If you came by to see me on Tuesday, I wasn't here. You say, where was you at, Rodney? Was you in your pajamas sleeping? No, I wasn't home sleeping. Wasn't in my pajamas. What I did have is I had a face that was all swollen. I had a head that was swollen like this. I looked like a cucumber on my head or something. I'm not sure what I looked like. My kids had a couple of names for me, and I don't appreciate it. They're still going to be grounded for that when I get feeling better. But so I had a European hornet sting me right here in the head. Right there, right? I mean, he just come right down, and he said, I'm going to hit you right there, and he hit me right there. And I had this terrible headache, and I just couldn't function at all. I had a headache for 24 hours, which I've never had. Now, some of you are like, Rodney, that's child's play. Listen, I have migraines that, well, it's big for me, okay? A European hornet was huge. And if you've seen these things, they look like a yellow jacket. They're about that big. I don't know that the stinger's that big. I'm just going to go with it. You know, remember, that doctor had a needle that long. Well, they still only go in about that far, but it doesn't matter. It was big. And he stung me in the head, and my head swelled up. So the sting is very appropriate for this third point, verses 12 through 22. Let's look at what happens. But King Vashti, verse 12, refused to come to the king's command brought by the eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him, and all those people's names, who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. Verse 15, what shall we do to Queen Vashti according to the law, because she didn't obey the commandment of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs? Verse 16, and Memucan answered before the kings and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also wronged all the princes and all the people who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. Now I want to stop here for a minute, because what I want to do is, the story is a heroic story. It's a heroic story. Mordecai's a great guy. It all works out for Mordecai. All works out great for Esther. All works out for the people of God. But what happens to Vashti? We don't read much about her here. She's blamed for not submitting to the king. She wronged the princes. How dare you not dance before us? And in fact, you know what you've done, Queen Vashti? You've wronged all the people too, because we were really looking forward to this. And Queen Vashti just kind of disappears right here. In this chapter, she's just going to kind of disappear. And we're kind of like, what happened to Queen Vashti? I want us to notice this. Sometimes in the Bible, we read of heroic stories. We read of people like Esther, and it all works out, and Esther's the star, right? But Vashti stood up for right. She did the right thing here, and there's no accolades given to her. And there's no reward that we read of in the book. And Vashti was what? Nothing. And sometimes we stand up for what's right, and it doesn't work out in this earth. We don't end up in the story, the hero. And sometimes we stand up for right, young people, and we don't end up with all the friends that we thought we would, because everybody's going to jump on the bandwagon if I stand for right. No, not everybody will jump on the bandwagon. Some people will turn on you. Your closest people sometimes will turn on you. What about Vashti? Well, she stood for right, no matter what the cost. And listen, friends, that's the story of Christianity. We are victors in the end. Not always in the story are we victors. Not only in this life, or not always in this life, I should say, are we going to be victors. We may go through lots of things. We may be, as the Hebrews writer said, sawn asunder. We may lose our heads. We may be crucified upside down. We may, like the apostles, all die, except one we think may have died of natural causes. That's the Apostle John. But every other one of them, we're pretty sure were martyred for Christ. And they did the right thing. Not always doing the right thing gives us accolades on the earth. Remember that, okay? It's not always a payday on Friday. But I promise you, there will be an eternal Friday where God will reward His saints. What about Vashti? I don't know. I want to give you food for thought. I look forward to seeing Vashti again in eternity. I really do. I think we're going to see her. Now, that's my opinion. You can differ with that. You say, oh, Rodney, no. We're not going to see her. I'll tell you what, the last part of I read about is what she stood up for right. And apparently died standing up for right. That's encouragement to me. That's what I leave you with tonight. Not always will you be the hero in the story, but at the end of the story, God will make sure He comes back around. Any questions or comments on the book yet? All right, so quick review as these little ones come in. We are Ezra 1 through 6 on our left leg. Ezra 7 through 10 on our left leg. Right between Ezra 6 and 7 is the book of Esther. All right, that's where we find ourselves. And these people did not return back to Jerusalem. They are in Persia, and they're going to make a difference where they are. Come back next week. We're going to pick up chapter 2. We're going to cruise right through this book, and then you're not going to want to miss it, because when we finish Esther, we're going into the book of Ecclesiastes with the title, Finding Meaning in a Meaningless World. Come back. See you Sunday. Don't forget to sign up the sheet for the sing, please.